Going live, you're live.
Okay, we are live. Sorry about the delay. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. This week, the topic is deflation. So that's a general decrease in prices across the economy. Some of us have read an article by George Selgin in which he argues that there's such a thing as a good kind of deflation. So I want to start by going around the room and getting people's initial thoughts on general thoughts about deflation, whether there's such a thing as deflation that is not bad or deflation that is good, and how that relates to basic income. What about deflation in the context of basic income, that kind of thing. So I'll start with Bethany.
Okay. Well, I think the thing that seems appealing about deflation is that your money is becoming more valuable in the short term, at least relative to the goods. So I guess like in an individual good market, that can be a good thing potentially. Like you might want housing to get cheaper. We've talked about that, for example.
Right.
Which could be sort of thought of as like deflation in the housing market specifically. But you know, I talk a lot to you about deflation, so I sort of have internalized the view that like this prices going down across the entire economy consistently has like some bigger picture effects in terms of making it difficult to plan how to spend, or like for markets to plan, and also it would sort of involve people continuously wanting to hoard their money. So it can be, what I've learned from you is it can be kind of like not very stable. It can sort of feed into more and more deflation pretty easily because people don't want to spend, and so like that affects prices even more.
Yeah.
So that's that view. But I guess the appeal of it is probably the idea that, oh, like in order for us to produce everything that we need to produce, if people don't have enough money, then like prices could just go down. Like that intuitively seems appealing, I think.
Right. Yeah, Steve.
I think I understand good inflation. I think I
Deflation?
Deflation. I want prices to go down, and I want quality to go up for everything. The most noticeable one is with computers. You expect the next year's version to be 10 times better, or 1,000 times faster, or something like that. And you might even hoard your money for a year, and because next year's model of computer is going to be so much better. But this is all thought to be a good thing.
Okay, Brian.
So it was an interesting article. Yeah, I like the idea of good deflation, of being able to get more for my money this year than I could last year. As far as it relates to basic income, though, I'm not really sure. So that's why I'm here tonight.
All right, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I was definitely like too tired for this level of econ trying to read this over dinner before tonight. Yeah, I feel like I sort of like have a like basic understanding of the argument that he's making, but don't really have like nuance. I was like, I feel like I've heard Alex like talk a lot about this, and so I have some guesses about Alex's opinions.
Yeah, Richard.
How it relates to basic income is that, basic income is unlikely to, increase over time, at least not without like big jumps every like 5 years or something like that. So if you have deflation, then it will, from if I'm understanding the article correctly, that it will, the prices will go, like it said in the article that like Social Security and things like that will, if there's inflation, it's not there. Since it's a fixed income, it won't go up, it will be worth less. But and with basic income, it's pretty much the same thing unless there's a big jump every like 5 years or every year or whatever it is, like with the COLA for Social Security, cost of living adjustment.
So you're saying that with inflation, the people on fixed incomes lose out, and with deflation, they win. And with a basic income that's at a fixed level, they also lose out over time until we increase the basic income. Is that what you're saying? Okay. I think that's right. Just out of curiosity, who noticed that the last two paragraphs of the article were duplicated? Yeah. So I thought that was interesting. So So George Selgin wrote this article, A Plea for Mild, in parentheses, Deflation, and he also wrote this book, Less Than Zero, where he basically makes the same argument. This book is from 1997, which is 2 years before the article. So his idea of what good deflation is that if the economy is becoming more productive, so we're able to produce more with the same amount of labor, the same amount of capital, the same amount of inputs, then you can keep the prices of the inputs the same and allow the prices of consumer goods to drop. So the idea would be that wages would kind of stay the same. So everyone would get the same income, the same wages, and all the goods and services in the economy would become cheaper. And he sees that as a good thing. I'm not convinced. So I think I like to come back to the question of what do we want from the economy, and then what do we want from money? What do we want money to do? So we want the economy to provide goods and services for consumers. And we want money to act as a standard unit of value in which we can set prices. So one of the main functions of money is that people can kind of assume it's got a consistent value, maybe not over 50 years, but day to day, month to month, that kind of thing. And then markets can set prices intuitively. Like it's money gives us less to think about. Because everything's priced in terms of this common standard. Like we know what it means to go 50 miles an hour. We have standard units, and money is supposed to be that. It strikes me that if you allow deflation when productivity increases,
but there's an issue with going 50 miles an hour and during a snowstorm, or if you're on a motorcycle and it's raining, and because they'll like skid or.
Yeah, I mean the way the law is written is that you're not supposed to go above the safe speed, and then the speed limit is like an absolute cap on that, supposedly.
But that could be something like with inflation during certain periods.
Yeah, so the question is, under what conditions would it be good to allow inflation or deflation? Now, it occurs to me that if you have a really big productivity increase, like we're producing a lot more stuff, the way we can give consumers access to additional production is to increase the level of the basic income, right? So instead of saying everything's cheaper, we can say, well, everyone has more money to spend. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're talking about how we want prices to be stable relatively, but we do target, or the Fed does target, like a small amount of inflation each year. And so I presume that this is he's kind of interested in the inverse, so that it's not like dramatic enough that it's hard to really understand the value of a dollar, but it's gradually stuff is being worth more. So can you talk about the asymmetry? Why can we target a little bit of inflation?
I can talk about that, but first I will say that George Selgin is not talking about the inverse of a small amount of deflation.
I just read that title there.
Yeah, it does say mild deflation, but what he's actually talking about is he wants deflation to exactly match the productivity increases in the economy. So if it's increasing fast, that's a lot of deflation, right? If it's increasing slowly, that's a little bit of deflation.
I see. So it would
be
more volatile in terms of price understanding the value of a dollar would be more difficult.
Yes, that's exactly right.
I think when the Federal Reserve first began, it was $1 is worth like $20 today or something like that. So that's rather drastic over 100 years.
Yeah, so over 100 years, of course, we've seen, like if you compare prices today to prices 100 years ago, there's no comparison, or there is a comparison, and prices are a lot higher today. But that's not important for the day-to-day functioning of money. The fact that prices were different a long time ago doesn't really matter. What matters is that markets can adjust and set prices and have a standard in which to operate today on kind of like a day-to-day basis. And I think that's something that's always going to be true and something that you're always going to want. Now, to Bethany's question about why does the Fed currently target small amounts of deflation or small amounts of inflation rather than small amounts of deflation, or maybe just targeting exactly zero and then it'll drift a little bit in either direction. Like, why are they so afraid of going over into deflation? And I think a big part of that has to do with the fact that we are expecting consumers to get their incomes from wages. So even if most businesses are doing well, if there happens to be one business that's struggling in a particular year, it's very hard to give your workers pay cuts. But if you have, like 2% inflation or something like that, you can give them less of a raise or no raise at all, and then you can kind of ride it out. So that kind of creates stability for firms. Yeah.
So would you say then that if most of people's incomes are coming from basic income, you could target a small amount of deflation?
I would say that if basic income were the primary source of consumer income, and we didn't live in a culture where people were so dependent on wages being fixed, then that would create more flexibility in wages. So it might actually be okay to target zero inflation, let it drift a little bit into deflation or inflation, and then kind of correct. But you'd be targeting zero inflation, yeah.
Because I remember you saying that you also thought that deflation was also more unstable and more likely to cause a spiral. So I thought that was
Right.
another reason that they target a little on the side of inflation.
Right, but this is why it's unstable.
Wait, this is why it's unstable?
Yes,
I thought it was
because
about people not wanting to spend.
if businesses have to, well, this is part of why it's unstable. If businesses have to fire workers, when they're not doing as well, if there isn't some inflation they can use as a buffer, then those workers, that's how consumers get their income. Those consumers no longer have money to spend in the economy, and it can create a problem where it's not just like a gradual thing, but it's like suddenly you're taking whole consumers out of the economy. People start defaulting on debts. Firms start defaulting on debts because they can't smoothly scale down their labor usage or the amount of money they're paying for labor, that kind of thing. And then it can kind of have this snowball effect.
So it's less about people not wanting to spend their money? I thought that was another reason.
Well, that's part of it. So I'd say that's more symmetrical to inflation.
It is.
So with inflation, people want to get rid of their money really quickly. That is maybe more compatible with what we think of as the function of money, like money is the thing you spend, not the thing you save.
Right.
In deflation, it can start to turn into something that people want to save, like, hey, this is an asset it's not going to provide a nominal return, but it'll provide a real return over time just by holding on to it. Yeah, Richard.
After the ASEAN crisis in like 1998, I believe it was.
Yeah.
Japan had like 20 years of deflation, and they got over it by increasing their VAT slowly, and so people don't want to save if the VAT's going to increase next week, so they're going to try to spend all they can before the VAT increases. And that's how they got over it.
So that's part of it. They also were the first ones to do like quantitative easing and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They've had zero interest rates since then, basically. So Tommy on the live stream says, you've told some stories about good deflation, paying less for better stuff. What do the anecdotal stories look like for bad deflation? Standing in line at the store, but they don't have capacity? No, it's more the other way around. It's more the stores have products that they can't sell because nobody has the money to buy them. So that's what bad deflation looks like. It looks like the Great Depression, when farmers couldn't sell their crops and they didn't want to lower their prices, so they threw them away, that kind of thing.
But why don't people have money when there's deflation?
It's not universally true that people don't have money when there's deflation. But if you start from a situation where people don't have enough money to spend, that can cause deflation. Mm-hmm. And this is what George Selgin calls bad deflation. And that's the kind of deflation we saw during the Great Depression. Yeah. It doesn't have to be the case, and he makes this point, and I think he's right, it doesn't have to be the case that deflation means people don't have money. Right. It could just be that your productivity increases, so there's a certain amount of spending that's going on in the economy, but now there are more goods being produced, so people are able to buy more goods with the same amount of spending. Yeah. So that's what he calls good deflation. I don't think it's good to just allow deflation to lower the prices, of consumer goods in proportion to production. That doesn't make sense to me because it contradicts the kind of the fundamental function of money as a standard of value. Yeah.
It makes sense for your computer and other technology things, right? You wouldn't.
Yeah. So any of this stuff can make sense for goods in individual markets. So all the time, prices are going down or going up, quantities are changing, that kind of stuff throughout the economy. What's important for money to retain its stable purchasing power is that the aggregate average of all the prices or all the kind of like the consumer good prices stays stable. So people can have an intuition of what a dollar is worth, and then other things are changing relative to that. You don't want the value of a dollar itself to change. So that's why it's okay for computers to get cheaper without it being okay for everything to get cheaper.
Yeah, this is
It's like with Bitcoin. It varies wildly.
Right.
So it's not used for.
Right.
So it's hard to think of things in terms of Bitcoin prices. It's more like an asset.
You can't price things in Bitcoin, which is why it's not a currency. Like what makes something a currency is how it's being used. If the economy is using the currency as a stable standard unit of value, then that's what makes it a currency. So you can't declare something a currency and says, oh, it hasn't achieved stable value yet. No, it's not a currency. That's why it's not a currency. Yeah.
So yeah, one point that I've heard you make about economics that this guy seems to agree with is that you can have what you would call like an output gap, like underproduction, if prices aren't able to lower across, like if the whole economy becomes more productive and prices aren't able to lower to meet that,
Right.
then you'll have underproduction. And people who study individual markets, they have this idea of prices clearing, right? Because prices of the market's clearing because the prices can move up and down.
Yes.
But economic policy doesn't allow the whole aggregate prices to move up and down. So the markets on an aggregate level can't clear. And that's something you talk about and something that sounds like he talks about. The difference is that he's more okay with volatility in the overall value of the dollar, it sounds like, in a way
Right.
that for the reasons you just described, you wouldn't favor. But
Right.
I guess another reason is like you have an alternative solution that you prefer as well.
Yeah, and I think I've read his book here, and I've looked at some of his talks, and I've argued with him on Twitter, which is when he told me to read the book.
Oh yeah, you got it for Christmas, right?
I got it for
Yeah.
Christmas. Yeah, I asked for it. Yes, so he will concede that there are two ways to ensure that consumers get the benefit of additional productive capacity. Either you can allow prices to go down, or you can boost incomes. But he's only thinking about it in terms of wages. And he's only thinking about the way that you boost wages is through monetary stimulus. So he's worried that the Fed is going to lower interest rates, overstimulate the economy. This will keep prices stable and allow consumers to spend more, but then it leads to asset bubbles. Like this is what I talk about all the
Another
time.
concern you have.
Right. So his answer to that is to allow deflation to occur, which means the Fed can tighten and you're not going to have the asset bubbles. So my answer to that is, instead of allowing deflation to occur, is that you increase the basic income, which also allows the Fed to tighten and prevents the asset bubbles without messing up on the standard value of money. And it also distributes it evenly among all consumers. Whereas if you're stimulating the labor market, there's still some distribution problems where it's not getting to everyone evenly.
Right.
And then the economy might still be underproducing because there's still some people out there who can't buy anything. The economy is not going to produce goods and services for the people who don't have any money, right? So
they
it
might
underproduces.
just like raise the prices on luxury goods at a certain point.
Yeah. You can make more money by selling to the people with money and charging higher prices.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's a first quote here. For many people, or I guess I should, deflation. For many people, the word conjures up images of the Great Depression, when prices fell dramatically throughout most of the world. The decline in prices was the counterpart of collapsed sales, widespread bankruptcies, and armies of unemployed workers. If a little inflation is the only guarantee against another calamity like that of the 1930s, then it is indeed a price worth paying. And I think this is how a lot of people think about deflation, that you want a little bit of inflation because tipping over into deflation is so dangerous. And I think it's somewhat true that it is dangerous to tip over into deflation, especially if we're living in a world where people are depending on jobs for their incomes, and the labor market is inflexible. Wages are sticky; they can't adjust downward. Yeah.
And this is for the reasons we were talking about before.
Right.
Like you're more likely to have more of these problems if you then have to lay people off, that kind of thing.
Right. You can't be like in an efficient market. You imagine that prices dynamically adjust a little bit. So this week maybe you made $10 an hour. Next week maybe you make $9.80 an hour. That kind of thing. That would be like the ideal for economists, but that's not okay for workers.
Right. And even things like legal contracts or like year-long most workers have a contract, or many do, so that can preclude that legally. And also just psychologically, people, it's similar to the issue of like understanding the value of a dollar. Like people kind of want to be able to plan for their amount of pay.
That's
and so people are kind of extra resistant to these volatile payment structures.
Yes.
So that's the sort of scenario that a lot of lower wage workers find themselves in. You work at a fast food restaurant or whatever, and when McDonald's gets more productive, they just cut your hours. They don't cut your
They
pay.
do the hours instead.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So that's happening more and more.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's something that is a problem when people are depending on that for their incomes.
Yeah.
It becomes less of a problem when we have something like a basic income. That's the main thing that people plan against. And George Selgin would say that if you allow deflation in the prices of everything out there, then in aggregate, the McDonald's of the world can keep paying their workers, for the same number of hours, but in aggregate, everyone's producing more stuff, so they're selling more stuff, and and all the workers are buying more stuff. So that's kind of what he's imagining as the ideal.
Yeah. And is there a reason they would do that instead of like Brian was saying, just continuing to cut the workers' hours?
If you imagine that they still need the same number of workers and the same number of hours to produce the higher quantity.
Because it inspires more production.
Right. The idea is that you'd have higher productivity, which is higher output per worker. So instead of cutting the hours, you boost the output.
Right.
More chicken nuggets.
And in that sense, you and he agree in terms of trying to get to that place. Boosting the output rather than like just cutting the output. Right.
And I would boost the output by raising the basic income so that people can buy everything the economy can produce, and maybe not lock in wages. Right. And it's also true that if you're looking at aggregates, it might be the case that the economy can produce a lot more for the same number of hours, but for individual businesses, that still might not be the case. Like it might be the case that people don't want more chicken nuggets, even though there's more stuff in general in the economy. I think it's okay to allow labor to be flexible. George Selgin gets into the difference between input prices or factor prices, like factors of production, versus output prices. So each one of these can have different price levels. So he's imagining holding the input prices stable and allowing the output prices to fluctuate with productivity. And I'm imagining holding the output prices stable and allowing the input prices to fluctuate. If the inputs get cheaper, then that's fine, but everyone's still paying the same price for the outputs. And I think this is the right way to do it, because if we think about the purpose of the economy, it's to provide the output for consumers. So the output is more aligned with what the economy is for. The consumers are who we care about the most, and they're the ones who you kind of want to establish a stable value for. Like the same amount of money can buy the same amount of consumer goods. So I focus on output prices, and this is generally what the Fed does anyway, right? It's what we do with our economic policy, is we focus on keeping output prices stable, consumer prices. I think if you're imagining a world without basic income, then a lot of his concerns start to make a lot more sense. Like you're worried that consumer incomes are going to be unstable if you try to fix the output price level, because they're all coming from wages and stuff like that. So
I think there's a comment.
So Tommy says, UBI is supposed to be universal for fairness reasons. Price fluctuations can also be unfair to some people over others. Is that why monetary policy is important for a functioning currency? Fairness? In my introductions before we go live, I give this little spiel about how we should avoid talking about fairness and talk about the underlying harm and benefit of the situation. I don't think, for one, I don't think the reason UBI should be universal necessarily is for fairness. I would say that you want it to be universal for efficiency. If you want to do income targeting, you can do that on the taxation side, and you might want to justify why it's better to take money away from rich people, that kind of thing. But all of that debate can happen on the taxation side. And then if you're distributing the income universally, evenly to everyone, then you don't have to worry about people navigating a system or the system being imperfect and some people not getting the benefit, that kind of thing. So I think that's a more compelling argument for why basic income needs to be universal. It's less about fairness and more about efficiency. Like you want to distribute incomes to people so they can reap the benefit of what the economy can produce for them. So price fluctuations can also be unfair to some people over others. And I think you can frame any price fluctuations. You can frame input price fluctuations as being unfair to some people or output price fluctuations as being unfair. And you can frame it in all kinds of different ways depending on what kind of fairness you care about. So again, I would look at how do we ensure that the economy is doing what it can for people, like the maximum benefit for people? How do we ensure that money is serving its role? And in order for money to serve its role as a standard unit, you would want the output prices to be stable. So it's less about fairness and more about predictability of prices and the purchasing power of money so that markets can be efficient. So I would say, yes, monetary policy is important for a functioning currency to keep prices stable, but it's not, I wouldn't say that it's about fairness necessarily.
You would say it's more fundamental, i.e. like anything that's too unstable, if there's an alternative, people are going to turn to that as their currency.
Yeah.
People just won't use something as a currency that isn't.
I mean, societies and economies have put up with a lot of really badly managed currencies, but there's a limit, right? If your currency really isn't working, you're going to find something else to use as your currency. Your economy will find something else. So in Venezuela, they price things in dollars because their currency is not being managed appropriately. Zimbabwe completely dropped their currency and switched over to the dollar. So markets will find a stable standard unit of value to use as their currency. So it's not,
like you kind of think of like that's kind of like what money is, as opposed to like something specific about the fairness of it or something maybe more nuanced.
I would say that money is an emergent property of markets. Markets need to find something stable to set prices in. So we have institutions that manage and enhance that stability. So we have central banks that they know their market is looking for a stable currency, and then they create something that's more stable than you would find in nature through monetary policy, and then that's how you get your economy to use that currency.
I think that's what Brian was saying.
Yeah,
Well,
Brian.
and it can be an emergent thing too. Like if you're in prison, you don't have access to dollars, so
Right.
you use tins of mackerel or cigarettes or whatever.
Right. Yep.
In like ancient Rome and Middle Ages and whatnot, they just decreased or increased the amount of gold or silver is in their currency to spur the desired effect.
Yeah. I think there are certainly lots of ways that institutions can manage the stability of currency, and one of them is to piggyback on something that people generally view as pretty stable, like a metal like gold or something like that. Obviously, we've moved on from there to something even better, but back then you could change the metal composition of your coins to help influence prices, that kind of thing.
There's a great example. It's like I hesitate to bring it up because it's so dark, but there's examples from the Holocaust like this too, where there were certain privilege coupons that only certain people can use. That's why I'm bringing it up. But everyone started using them as money. So it's very clearly like a piggyback system, where if I have this coupon, I might not even be able to use it because the Nazis only allowed some people some things,
Right.
whatever. But like everybody started to use it as money because it was sort of piggybacking off of the value that it had for some people.
Yeah, and that's true
So
for
it's a
the
really good conceptual example.
for the cigarettes too, right? Like
I
you're
guess
still
not
going to
everyone
accept them
smokes.
as payment even if you
Right.
don't smoke, and
That's
then
probably a
you'll
better example.
use
I'll
it as
that
money.
one.
Yeah.
It's less
Yep.
depressing, but,
Yep. That's right. And then if people are using something as money in this way, and it gets so widely used that it's like the universal unit of account, medium of exchange, that kind of thing, then it becomes more important to keep it stable relative to the price of consumer goods rather than to keep it stable relative to what it was initially going to be used for. So So, for example,
Right.
I guess what's a good example of this?
There's a story about those islands that use the big giant rocks.
Oh, yeah.
And then one of them sunk.
We were
in the
talking
middle,
about that in
and
another
They
meeting.
still
Yeah.
use it as part of their economy.
Yeah.
Even though it's at the bottom
You
of
can't
the
really
ocean.
get to it anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah, money doesn't
Yeah.
need to be a physical thing. Yeah.
Right.
You guys ready for the next one?
Sure.
Since the disastrous 1930s, economists and central bankers seem to have lost sight of the fact that there are two kinds of deflation, one malign and the other benign. Malign deflation, the kind that accompanied the Great Depression, is a consequence of shrunken spending, corporate earnings, and payrolls. Strictly speaking, even in this case, it is not so much deflation itself that is harmful as its underlying cause, an inadequate money stock. The hoarding of money, or its actual disappearance, the quantity of money in the US economy actually shrank 35% between 1930 and 1933, causes the demand for goods and services to dry up. In response, firms are forced to curtail production and to lay off workers. Prices fall, not because goods and services are plentiful, but because money is scarce.
Yeah.
So this is what we were talking about with bad deflation. One thing that I notice in how he talks about money is that he definitely talks about the money stock and the money velocity. Like there's a certain amount of money that's circulating. That's how he's thinking about it. He does sometimes talk about like, well, what if the velocity slows down over time? And of course, that would happen if people hoard money, right?
Right.
Which is something that I view as like a natural part of the process. Like businesses accumulate money over time. It's always the case that the productive economy is producing goods and services, so there's goods and services flowing to consumers, and then there's money flowing in the other direction. So in order to keep the whole thing going, you need to have a mechanism for replenishing spending money in the hands of consumers. And some of that can be jobs, some of that can be borrowing. But really, if you're expecting it to just kind of happen on its own, you're expecting the economy to be kind of a perpetual motion machine, which it's not. There needs to be a continual stream of money coming in. Or you could expect prices to continue to decrease. But that would be not the kind of deflation that he's okay with, because it wouldn't necessarily reflect an increase in productivity. Just at our level of production, you would expect money to flow away from consumers in aggregate over time. So there needs to be a way to replenish that. And even George Selgin would want to replenish that because he only wants to allow deflation in response to changes in productivity.
And so when he says that the money stock shrinks 35%,
Yeah.
Obviously that's not people burning cash.
Right.
So I'm curious which kinds of things he thinks of as money, and is that really about the velocity of it, or what is he?
He's probably thinking of banks failing. So people have deposits in banks, which they count as money.
Yeah.
Can't withdraw your deposit, that money's gone.
That's a pretty
And
concrete.
they stop making new loans too. They don't loan
Yep.
out
Right,
money that way.
right.
Yep.
And you might, according to the way that you think
And the
about money.
speculation in the stock market.
Yeah, so I was wondering if he included things like other kinds of credit or beyond like bank deposits
So-
that are sort of money-like.
Right,
too.
this is an interesting question because
Yeah.
it's always arbitrary where you draw the line between what's money and what's not.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know where he's drawing the line in particular. My guess is that he's not including the stock market stocks and that kind of stuff.
Right.
He's probably including bank deposits. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's, and like the ability to take out a loan too. So like there's lots of,
Right.
it's probably even more than that is what I'm thinking. And if you also include velocity.
Well, the loans themselves, they create bank deposits.
do, yeah.
And then when they're repaid, the bank deposits go away. So the bank doesn't even need to fail in order for the deposits to shrink.
Definitely.
Right, just people need to repay their loans without the banks issuing new loans. I think that's what Brian
Yeah,
is pointing
no,
out.
that makes
Yeah.
sense. But I was also thinking about the way that people behave differently if they know it's harder to get a loan. Like they might then hoard more
Right,
of
so
their money.
that he would describe, right, as a decrease in velocity of money.
Yeah.
So for me, I don't know how useful it is of an exercise to separate the concepts of money stock and money velocity, and I just think about the level of spending. How much are people spending, and what are the ways to fund that spending, to support that spending? How do you rein it in when it's too much? How do you make sure the distribution of the spending flows are optimal? That kind of thing. Yeah.
But if the amount of money is magically cut in half, how come prices don't also, as quickly as possible, cut in half?
I mean, there was a lot of deflation during the 1930s. Are you asking why it's not one-to-one?
Or why didn't the market react And could the market have reacted, in theory, fast enough to
I see.
stabilize the economy?
So I think this gets more to what I was talking about earlier, where employers are reluctant to lower wages because employees are not going to put up with that. So there's resistance there. There's price stickiness. So there's wage stickiness, and then there's price stickiness too. They, like if you don't want to lose money on, like, nominally, you don't want to lose money on your product, then you're not going to sell for less than what you paid to produce it. Or if you lower your prices on your produce now, then maybe you're not going to be able to sell a small amount at a higher price, which would be more profitable or less of a loss for you, right? That kind of thing.
So people were like getting rid of goods instead of lowering the prices.
And also
Right,
there's like a trade war of tariffs across the board, and they weren't able to trade between each other.
That also happened, Smoot-Hawley, all of that. Yeah, so there is this pressure in and around the Great Depression to maintain the gold standard, especially the early part of the Depression. And that created lots of tension because what the economy really needed was more money, but they were afraid that if they issued more money, that it would put pressure on the gold reserves, that kind of thing. So the gold standard really had a hand in the Depression as well. But yeah, I mean, prices never adjust instantaneously in any markets. So it's and generally speaking, it's harder for prices to adjust downward than adjust upward. Usually, well, I mean, it all depends, but yeah, I mean, you can have an inflationary situation that's really bad too. So,
like the stagflation.
Yeah, that.
So some businessman would have to. He bought $100 worth of inputs, and he wants to sell it for 110. But then now suddenly there's only half as much money.
Right.
He can only sell it now for 50.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He has to be smart enough to actually sell it for 50, knowing that eventually the system will all come to equilibrium, except he has to take one for the team immediately.
Right.
And nobody wants to do that.
Right, that's right. So that's part of it. And then another part of it is maybe he can sell a smaller number of units at a higher price that won't result in that much more of a loss than lowering the price. So it can be tricky depending on what kind of demand he's facing. So if there are still people out there who have enough money to buy the thing at full price, it might be most profitable for him to keep it at full price and not sell the rest, and then in the next round of production just produce a smaller amount and sell it to the people who still have money, that kind of thing.
This is where the distribution, which Alex talks about, of the money is really important. But is it better to produce more at a lower price? Or
That's right. Yeah, Brian.
Well, so in that second round of production, then you lay off half your workers. So
That's
you
right.
don't have as much supply.
And then in aggregate across the economy, now there's even fewer of those people who have money, and the cycle continues. Yeah. Yep. So here we go. Benign deflation is something else altogether. It is a result of improvements in productivity, that is, occasions when changes in technology or in management techniques allow greater real quantities of finished goods and services to be produced from a given quantity of land, labor, and capital. Because an increase in productivity is the same thing as a decline in the unit costs of production, a productivity-driven decline in the prices of finished goods and services needn't involve any decline in producers' earnings, profits, or payrolls. Lower costs are matched by correspondingly lower consumer prices, not by lower wages or incomes. Such productivity-driven inflation is actually good news to the average breadwinner.
With automation, then you can have, like with the example of a fast food restaurant, there's a burger flipping robot and there's a frying robot and the kiosks. You don't need as many workers, so you can get rid of 9 out of 10 of your workers or half of them or something.
Right.
And you don't need the payrolls and will go down, but the profits go up.
Yeah, so I think Selgin is specifically imagining a scenario in which if you only need 1/10 of the worker, what you're going to do is employ the same number of workers and produce 10 times as much stuff.
Yeah.
And there's only so far you can go with that.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
I thought the way it works was you fire 9 of the workers and then give a bonus to the CEO. Isn't that how the
Yeah.
Yeah,
economy's
right,
supposed to
right.
work?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because as you said, there might not be a demand for like the increase in automation productivity could be higher than the increase in demand.
Right.
Like, let's say we can mostly make all cars with machines. Let's even ignore self-driving cars or something. Like, now you might not, you could use like one worker for 100 you had before. You don't necessarily have 100-fold demand for cars in the economy that you can then just like have the same number of workers and produce 100 times as many cars.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of reiterating what you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think, something that maybe Selgin doesn't acknowledge is that the labor market is never really an efficient way to distribute money to consumers. And then, productivity increases like this can make it less efficient. So it's not just a matter of allowing prices to come down and then people can buy more stuff because people can't really depend on incomes from wages anyway in the first place. But with something like a basic income, it doesn't really matter, how much labor people happen to be using. If increased productivity results in lower employment and the output doesn't scale up to match the productivity, that's fine. The basic income can allow consumers to activate whatever capacity there is and whatever capacity they want to activate. Yeah.
So to what extent do you think benign deflation was what produced what Richard was talking about in Japan for 20 years, where their economy didn't grow?
Yeah, I
Actually,
think
it was because the world market collapsed in the region, so it was like all the loans and things, and so they weren't able to.
So I think it was a lot of it. I think a lot of it would be what Selgin would classify as benign deflation. And there have been other times in history when Selgin is critical because economists are saying, oh, this was a period of depression or something like that. And he's saying, no, it wasn't. This was actually just us getting more productive. So there was a period in England in the late 19th century, which was called the Long Depression or the Great Depression or something like that, which he argues was not actually a depression. So I think he's right that there is such a thing as benign deflation in that it's not as bad as the kind of deflation we saw in the 1930s. But that doesn't mean we want it. It's still worse than just having stable consumer prices. And I think he talks about what matters is the cause of the inflation, and I think to some extent that's true. If the cause of deflation is that people don't have enough money to spend, then you're in a bad situation. And if the cause of deflation is that productivity is increasing, then you're in a good situation. But it's still the case that in either of those cases, ideally you would want to prevent the deflation anyway, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
Wouldn't it be more of a tricky trade-off though for you, Alex, if you didn't have basic income on the table? Because that's kind of the situation that this guy is in.
Yes.
His mind.
I mean, yes, it is a tricky. It's a lot. Everything gets trickier if you're expecting people to get their incomes from jobs, and this is why we have so many arguments about free trade versus protecting American. Throughout economic policy, it just throws a monkey wrench in the whole thing to expect people to get money from jobs. Yeah.
I'm having trouble imagining an increase in productivity that does not involve somebody losing their job, a human losing his job.
So an example would be there's a firm that,
So it's at Wall Street. Banks. They're laying off half of their workers so they can automate most of those jobs.
So I guess in terms of concrete examples, I think that's tough. But you could imagine the economy as a whole. If you're increasing productivity, that can mean you're producing the same amount of stuff with less labor, or it can mean you're producing more stuff with the same amount of labor.
Yeah.
So the idea is that if you allow the deflation to lower prices, then you can produce more stuff with the same amount of labor.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Or similarly, if you give people basic income to activate the new capacity that you get from your new productivity, that allows you to produce more stuff with less labor without the deflation.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see.
One example I would have is in like the construction industry, when you went from hand nailing everything to using, nail guns and stuff, that they didn't fire people, they just were able to build more things more efficiently.
Yep.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, ready for the next one? Since World War II, the United States has witnessed frequent gains in productivity. The real inflation-adjusted unit cost of production of goods and services today is approximately half of what it was in 1945. Yet, the general price level, instead of being half as high as it was after the war, has increased to over 9 times its former level. Instead of allowing goods prices to fall along with their falling real costs of production, the Fed has artificially inflated those prices by pumping large amounts of money into the economy. The last time productivity improvements were allowed to be reflected, partially and temporarily, in a fallen price level was 1955, 44 years ago. And that was not by design, but by accident. So I think part of, he's also partly objecting to the inflation over time. The fact that prices were 10 times as high in 1999 as they were in 1945. That kind of stuff doesn't really bother me at all because go ahead.
So it seems like all else being equal, even though it's like a small amount of change in prices, it still has effects for trying to plan, things like investments that are going to take a long time to mature, or like long-term life plan. It does affect some planning.
If inflation is fairly stable and low numbers around 2%, you can factor that in to your investment plan. I would say that ideally, we would be in an economy where targeting zero inflation wasn't something that was so dangerous, and I think maybe we can get closer to that with basic income. But it's not the end of the world for the people who are really thinking about planning and stuff to factor in inflation. What matters for money to work is that for the day-to-day stuff, people don't have to think about it. They can just assume that nominal prices are real prices and it all works.
I think that's right, but I also think, and this is not a huge deal, but part of your argument about people's quote unquote pay cuts through their jobs has to do with the fact that we don't really think about inflation very easily as a day-to-day thing, even when it's happening. And for example, if you get a 2%, I've had the problem in my own mind, and I'm a relatively educated person, a 2%, rate on a savings, on savings seems decent because you don't get very good savings rates. And then you just realize it's the same as inflation, or it might be less than inflation, and you're not actually earning anything on your money. But it takes a mental step to do that, and I'm not sure everybody thinks about it like that.
I think when people are planning their investments, either themselves or through their financial planners, that is factored in, generally speaking.
I think for high level investing, but in terms of just saving money, or like you said, not getting a raise year after year, part of your whole point is that people don't treat that emotionally the same as a pay cut, even though it is equivalent.
I guess, so you're worried about investments not being efficient?
No,
or
I mean, I guess I'm just saying it's subtle, but there still must be some cost to things working smoothly, to small amounts of change in price levels. I get that they're reliable, but they still make it slightly harder to think about the value of a dollar over time, that's all.
So Tommy says inflation is also a convenient way to make it so that cash in the mattress slowly rots away. I'm not sure that that's super important.
Well, in the case of right after 1945, it might be because we had an enormous national debt from the war, which was convenient to inflate away. That it rot in its mattress.
I think that's. I think that can be part of it. I think a lot of this, the effects that you see from inflation, the big ones happen if people aren't expecting it. So if you're just going along, prices are fairly stable, and then you're like, okay, we're going to introduce inflation. Now you can kind of screw over the people who lent money. But if people are expecting inflation, if lenders are expecting inflation, even the people who lend to the government or whatever, then they're going to factor that into their decision process. Yeah.
But you were also saying before that you want money to be the thing that people are spending. And that's kind of to this point.
We do want money to be the thing that people are spending. In terms of money in cash in mattresses, I mean, there are a lot of things that are analogous to cash in mattresses. Usually people don't physically stuff cash into their mattresses anymore, at least, but they invest in assets that are expected to provide a positive return over time. So inflation obviously eats into that, but then the interest that you earn, you're probably going to calculate inflation in that anyway. And people saving money and hoarding money is not necessarily a problem. I think George Selgin talks about how it hurts the velocity of money, that kind of thing, a couple paragraphs up. But that's just natural. The money can be replaced. Like, it's not a problem if people stuff money in the mattress if you can just replace the money and what you're worried. I think what most people are worried about when people stuff money in the mattress is that it will fuel a deflationary spiral or something like that. But if you're just the government and you're coming in and you're replacing any money that people remove from the economy, and you're keeping spending in line with what the economy can handle, you're not actually going to have that deflationary problem.
Like with those silver quarters in the 70s, where they had the reason why they switched over to lesser metals is because people were hoarding the quarters back then.
So we reached a point where the metal in the quarter was worth more than the quarter was worth, which is now true for pennies and nickels. But I think it's such a small amount that nobody cares. It's also, I guess it was illegal then to treat them that way, and it's illegal to do that with the pennies and nickels. But if a penny was worth $500, people would figure out a way to melt that down and stuff. So this is a good point. So Tommy says, or even just putting it in a bank where it can be tracked more easily. Cash attracts crime in ways that banks don't. There's an entire world of organized crime, and they have rooms stacked to the ceiling with $100 bills, and they use cash, and cash is definitely harder to track.
Like in India, they eliminated the 500 rupees or whatever,
right, yep.
And then they kept the next one up or something like that, and so people were rushing in to try to cash in all their 500 rupees or whatever.
Yeah, that happened recently in the past few years.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was, So making money easier to track so you can inflate away the untrackable money. So that's actually a really good point. I said people don't stuff their cash in mattresses, but criminals might and do. So that's a good point. Anyone have any comments on this quote before we move to the next one?
What do you think the feeling would be if the price of goods fell 50% over whatever the time span was? I mean, wages would have to fall with it, right? How would you feel if you were making half as much as your parents were?
So I think Selgin's point is that wages wouldn't have to fall with it. That the price of consumer goods falls as a result of an increase in productivity, so everyone's still working the same amount, getting paid the same amount, but now they're able to buy more stuff with the lower prices.
But in the last 40 years, people's wages, they're earning less than their parents are, but their prices have actually increased.
Right. So we're imagining the scenario that George Selgin is describing, where since 1945, since productivity doubled, it could be the case, or it could have been the case that prices were half, but it didn't end up working out that way. I think over that long time span, again, you're comparing, vastly different time periods. I think a small amount of deflation year to year, it doesn't have to be a bad thing, just like a small amount of inflation doesn't have to be a bad thing. But that, the caveat there is that I don't just want to say any increase in productivity should have a commensurate decrease in prices. I still want to be targeting a stable standard unit of value. And if it happens to shake out that 50 years later your prices are half of what they were, then okay, sure, fine, whatever. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess his argument would be that it's more palatable than prices going up, assuming I guess your income is the same. It's like going to a country where things are cheaper versus
Right.
where things are more expensive.
Sure.
And it's kind of nice.
Yeah.
When your money goes
I
forward.
think part of the concern he has, I mean, there's a few concerns he has with the inflation, and one of them is that it since he's imagining it coming from the Fed, that it's going to kind of overstimulate the financial sector and cause these booms and busts and that kind of thing. And he also, I mean, like, I don't need to say that I think this, but he definitely does see this kind of, you can look at the price level and now it can tell you, it's a signal of how productive we are. Like he's really into that. I don't think we should be using the price level in that way. I don't think that makes sense. We have other measures of productivity, and, you know, prices are, you know, money is money, and prices are supposed to be standard. It's not supposed to be this way of like getting this insight into like, oh, prices are half, therefore we're twice as productive or something. You don't need that.
So you think it's easier psychologically for your income to go up and prices to stay stable than for your prices to go down and your income to stay stable?
Psychologically, I mean, I think it's more efficient for markets, for the prices of consumer goods to be consistent. It's easier for people to reason about these things. I don't know if people would be sadder one way or the other.
Well, not just saying sadder, but I mean, I guess I'm thinking of individuals are part of the market. They're making plans about what to do. So they have to adjust either for their incomes going up or prices going down.
During the Great Recession, things like orange juice or whatever, the prices remained the same, but the quantities in the quantity of orange juice went down.
Right. This is, what do they call this? There's a term for it. I forget what it is. It's something like packaging inflation or something like that. Yeah. And then they put like the little divots in the bottom so it looks the same size, that kind of thing. Yeah. So Tommy says, if wages don't fall, then is it really full-on deflation, or is it just relative price change between certain goods and certain labor activities? So I think this is what George Selgin is talking about when he's talking about good deflation. And he's separating the notion of input prices like wages and, you know, other resources, like how much that costs, versus output prices, which are the final consumer goods that you get. And he wants to keep input prices stable and let output prices drop. So it is deflation technically if you're measuring deflation against a basket of consumer goods. This is, you know, like we have consumer price indices and stuff like that. So it technically is deflation even if people's wages don't come down. And that's what he's saying is the good kind of deflation. Yeah. So do you have a thought or?
Well, I guess the other thought would be, well, instead of incomes cutting in half, what if the work week went from 40 hours to 20 hours?
That would seem nice.
I'm not sure how that would work.
So it is an interesting thought. I think, you know, in order for the economy to produce everything it needs to produce, what matters is that the total amount of labor is sufficient to produce that stuff. It doesn't necessarily matter whether any one person happens to be working any specific amount of time. So you can imagine that some people are working 80-hour weeks, some people are working not at all. As long as the incentives are such that the optimal amount of labor is being performed, then we're going to be fine. So I would. That's
assuming with a basic income, right? Otherwise, some people are making no money.
Without a basic income, yeah, you have to distort the labor market in ways
just
that.
To make clear what your assumption.
Right. Yeah. So without a basic income, you have to promise people jobs somehow, and you have to promise them sufficient wages at those jobs somehow, right? Because that's what you're relying on for their income. So yeah, you could cut the working hours in half. And keep the same pay, but maybe it's twice as much per hour or something. I don't know, there's various kind of manipulations you could do.
We've talked in here about like what would happen with a pretty sizable basic income. Like there would be different factors that affected amount of time. One of the factors is like what the worker actually wants to do, because they've got a lot of negotiating power. The other factor is like what's efficient for that industry. So like some industries, it's fine to just show up like 5 hours a week. Some industries you go through like 15 years of training. before you do it, and so it's not as efficient to then have
Yeah.
that person like work 5 hours a week.
And then there's,
Yeah.
we have very well-defined, laws about what counts as a job, what counts as labor, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Maybe some of that is starting to break down. But if you had a basic income, maybe you wouldn't really be able to measure that much, like how many hours someone is putting in or how much they're being paid per hour or something like that. You would just know that in general, there's a labor market, which is a market for getting people to do things, and, stuff is being produced and people are able to buy it with the money they have and that kind of stuff. You wouldn't necessarily need to keep track of who's employed or how employed they are or how many jobs there are or something like that. It might become hard to define. We might want to allow it to be hard to define, to allow more flexibility in how people spend their time and what they choose to do with their time. Yeah. So the last decade or so has witnessed substantial gains in labor productivity, along with smaller gains in total factor productivity, making the present era one in which significant reductions in the nominal cost of living might have been painlessly achieved. The world's central bankers have, however, been unwilling to let those reductions occur. Yeah, go ahead.
So does he think that commensurate increases in quality of life have been achieved just through people's wages going up, but that's kind of had the side effect of like an overblown financial sector? Or does he think that we haven't even seen the gains in terms of being able to purchase more things or things like that? Yeah.
I think it's more the first one.
The first one. Okay.
Yeah.
Actually, during the 90s, since the Soviet Union collapsed, there were a lot of they weren't able to like manufacture things, so you were able to sell to them. So that means there was a whole market opening up.
Anyone have any more thoughts on that one?
It was sort of like after World War II with all the destruction of Europe's economy.
Yeah.
So consider first deflation's effect on debtors. Suppose that over the course of 1 year, overall productivity unexpectedly rises 2% and the general price level declines 2%. Then, although creditors will earn a higher real interest rate than they anticipated, debtors will have no reason to complain. Although the real value of debtors' obligations rises, so does their real income, while the nominal payments burden borne by them is unchanged. Debtors can, in other words, afford to pay higher real rates of interest and might well have agreed to such rates in advance had they and their creditors both been equipped with perfect foresight. A monetary policy aimed at deliberately preventing prices from falling would, in this case, merely deprive creditors and other people with fixed incomes, including persons living on Social Security, of their fair share of productivity gains being enjoyed by all other income earners.
What happens if the debt is higher than their income each year or something like that? What happens if they need more credit than they earn?
So the idea here is that in aggregate, people's real incomes would increase due to the deflation at the same time that their debt burdens would increase, so it would offset. Does that make sense?
What
if they're unable to pay back, the idea is that if they're unable to pay back the debts, they would have been unable to pay back the debts without the deflation anyway, because the deflation is perfectly representing a productivity increase in the economy.
So,
yeah, right.
So this is one of the big losers under this scenario are people like farmers who borrow a lot of money to buy expensive machinery and stuff, and then the prices of their product come down, so their income comes down, and they can't repay it. They can't repay their debts with the deflationary. I mean, this was at the end of the 19th century. Right, this was farmers, William Jennings Bryan and the Cross of Gold speech and all that stuff. Deflation was a real problem for a lot of people.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Are they going to be able to...
So he assumes that their real income stays the same, but
Right.
if you're selling what you're producing and prices are falling, then that's not...
He's assuming that the real debt goes up, the real debt that you owe goes up, but that your real income also increases.
So I think you would have to assume for the farmers that even though you're prices of each thing are going down, you're producing a lot more with those machines? Like you're selling more, so your income is still going up? Is that how it works?
So this is part of the problem because it doesn't work necessarily for an individual business. You can have a productivity increase in the economy that has nothing to do with this farmer, right? So there's a productivity increase somewhere else that's causing prices to come down. The farmer still has the same machines that he bought and the same equipment, and he gets screwed over. So I think this is something that's true, that some of these things that look nice in aggregate might not work at the level of the individual business, and then you'd see some of the kinds of disruptions that you might see in bad deflation, even if it's the kind of deflation that George Selgin would call good deflation. Yeah, so I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, and is that symmetrical for inflation? Because obviously inflation affects different people differently too.
I would say that it's roughly symmetrical for inflation. Usually, the people that lose out with inflation are going to be the ones who did the lending, because now it gets easier for the borrower to pay back the debt. But now, when the lender gets the money back, he didn't get the return he was hoping in real terms.
And those are Social Security and fixed incomes.
Those on Social Security with fixed incomes, there's...
And they're for people with basic incomes who are not indexed for inflation or anything.
Right. So if your benefit program is indexed to inflation, then obviously that cancels that out. If you have a basic income and it's just calibrated to the productive capacity of the economy, then inflation is not going to be a problem. The basic income might not be indexed to inflation per se, but it would be the maximum amount that the economy can sustain at whatever price level you happen to be at. So people with fixed incomes, there's problems. So there's going to be, the more inflation you have and the more deflation you have, the more you have these things that are not lining up in terms of people's expectations, and you're going to have some winners and some losers. His argument is that in aggregate, if you balance deflation perfectly with productivity gains, then it's a wash. But in practice, that's going to be very difficult because different parts of the economy are doing different things. So you're going to have winners and losers in different parts of the economy, maybe even more so than you would have had if you just kept prices stable. Yeah.
I think Tommy has some.
So Tommy says, so labor isn't a consumer good, aside from direct services like haircuts, perhaps. Sounds like a fairness issue again.
Oh, I think you said that just now when we were talking about winners and losers.
Winners and losers. Yeah, that sounds like right. So depending on who you are and where you are in the economy, you might see some things as more fair and other people might see other things as more fair, that kind of thing. But it is a fairness issue kind of from the perspective of the individual people who are being affected, but it's also an efficiency issue from the big picture. Like we don't want the economy to be disrupted too much. So if there's things that are unfairly benefiting people in one way in one place and the other way in another place, that creates disruptions in the markets. You guys ready for the next one? It's just the next one. Those who insist, nevertheless, upon a policy of price level stabilization, like me, as the only equitable policy, would do well to consider what such a policy entails in the event of a setback to productivity. When productivity declines, the only way to keep the price level stable is by shrinking nominal incomes. Debtors might then find it not only difficult, but perhaps impossible to repay their loans. If it is admitted that debtors' and creditors' interests are best served by an increase in prices when productivity declines, then a symmetrical reasoning suggests that those same interests are best served by allowing prices to fall as productivity advances. So this is an interesting question, and it does kind of come down to like thinking about the fairness question. For me, price level stabilization is not about equitable policy. It's about having a stable currency for the markets to operate in. Now the question is, if productivity declines, should we shrink the basic income, or should we allow a period of inflation, right? So what he's saying here is, what do you do in the event of a setback to productivity? So when productivity declines, the only way to keep the price level stable is by shrinking nominal incomes. So that means making it so that people have less money to spend. And he's imagining it happening in the form of wages. We would probably do it here. Well, we'd try to tighten monetary policy as much as we could, but if basic income was close to the highest level the economy can sustain, then we might have to reduce the amount of basic income to keep prices stable. So it's an interesting question. Would you want to do that, or would you want to just allow inflation to reduce the purchasing power of the basic income? Either way, the purchasing power of the basic income decreases. It's just a matter of...
Right. I mean, it has to, because you don't have as much productive capacity.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah.
Can you think of an example scenario where the overall productivity declines in the country?
Yeah, you get hit by an asteroid.
A recession.
Technically, war
could
should be this,
a
because
war.
war burns resources. But because we're often not at capacity and we're really more like demand driven, we see war as times of upping productivity. But if you were already at productivity cap, and then you had to like go basically like have a lot of people die, make a lot of new machines, and then destroy those machines, like that's basically what war is.
So you're diverting resources away from your domestic economy in a time of war.
Way. So I think if we were at capacity, then a war would be a time. Like a big scale war would be a time where we'd have concerns about it of this kind of nature.
Because if you think about domestic productivity, a lot of people's labor and a lot of our resources are going to something that doesn't count toward production in the domestic economy.
In a war.
In a war.
Like you're going to like build planes to go like crash them or have them be blown up instead of like building domestic planes or food. Or
so Richard said recessions, and the question is, like, yes, recessions, but the question is, what would cause a recession if everybody has enough money to spend to activate the economy's full productive capacity? So the question is, what would bring down the economy's productive capacity? And Bethany gave a great example. Yeah, Richard.
During the Middle Ages, the bubonic plague caused like a quarter of Europe's population to die off, and wages grew substantially because there weren't as many workers.
Right. So that's an interesting example where productivity probably increased because you have fewer workers and you still have demand for a similar amount of products. So if you're in a situation where you kill off half the workers, that can result in more productivity because now you have fewer workers and you're trying to achieve the same level of output.
In terms of how productivity is measured?
Productivity is the amount of output per unit of input. So if you have fewer units of input, then that can correspond to higher productivity. Yeah. But I like the example of war, especially like something like World War II, which wasn't happening here. So there were some people who were fighting abroad, and a lot of them did die, but the main thing that happened wasn't that everybody died. The main thing that happened was that we were using labor and we were using other resources and we were putting it towards something else. So if you're just looking at the output in the domestic economy, consumer goods, that kind of stuff, we had a lot less production for a lot more input.
And we did have targeted rations and stuff at that time.
Right.
Which isn't the same thing.
And it's also true that people got incomes as a result of this, and that activated some capacity that might not have been activated before, that kind of thing as well.
And people bartered their ration coupons. I don't want meat, so I want more gasoline, so I'm going to trade this or that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Did you have a comment, Brian?
So when productivity declines, the only way to keep the price level stable is by shrinking nominal incomes. And I'm still trying to picture a scenario where you would...
So,
right. Yeah, go ahead.
So let's say the asteroid hits and we can only produce like half as much stuff. So there'll either be inflation because the same amount of money is chasing half as much stuff, or to avoid inflation, people have to have half as much money. I think.
So you have to cut their spending.
Chasing half as much stuff.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It makes more sense, yes.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Like in some economies, they're like, we'll take off a zero from our $50,000 bill or whatever like that. Right. We'll slash it off. You just don't notice it anymore.
So the falsity of the belief that deflation must involve falling wages has already been alluded to. When productivity rises, so do workers' real wages. In other words, nominal money wage rates rise relative to the cost of living. If the productivity gains are allowed to take the form of falling output prices, then money wage rates will remain stable or will rise modestly. The second result obtains if prices fall at a rate equal to the growth rate of total factor productivity, which usually progresses more slowly than the growth rate of labor productivity. Otherwise, if the monetary authorities insist on preventing the price level from falling, productivity gains must take the form of more rapidly increasing money wages. So I would just say, or higher basic income. Yeah.
So I guess I'm still confused a little bit about his theory, and does he really think that these productivity gains end up in the hands of people via wages? Because I feel like, again, with automation and other things, it's not clear that they end up in the hands of people via wages.
The productivity gains imply that there's more actual production per
not just
unit.
possible, but actual.
Right. It's not like, oh, I feel productive. I feel like I could produce a lot of stuff. It's I actually am producing more stuff per unit of labor.
So
somebody has to be buying
getting
it.
through their wages. I understand that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it could be like an increasingly skewed distribution of wages.
Yes,
right?
very much so.
Or it could be like government cheese.
Okay.
What's government cheese?
Where they encourage the farmers to produce a lot more milk, but it's not selling, so the government buys it and turns it into cheese, and they distribute the cheese to like the homeless or something.
First, they just put it in a bunch of caves for a few years. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in what sense could it be like government cheese? Are you saying that the government is the one is doing the buying?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I think all the issues that you pointed out, Bethany, are there. And problems with just boosting people's wages. It's uneven distribution. Not everyone's going to see the benefit. And also, as George Selgin points out, if you do that through monetary stimulus, you create unsustainable, credit bubbles and that kind of thing, asset bubbles. Yeah.
Does he talk about the issue of, like, I guess he might think that deflation benefits people more evenly, kind of the way that a basic income would, and so people are more likely to see the benefits?
I think he's probably not questioning the assumption that the labor market distributes income to consumers, and that's just kind of the way it is. And if there's a problem with that going on, that would be not his area of expertise, that kind of thing.
Getting into that.
Right. He would say, like, well, there might be issues with that and we should fix them. That's not what I'm talking about. And I'm just assuming that wages are how people get their money.
So the downside for him is just more this issue of puffing up the financial sector?
Yes.
Does he also feel that we're not seeing the maximum productivity increases, or does he not get into that either?
I don't think he gets into that. I think he's worried about puffing up the financial sector. I think he thinks there's a delay. So the first thing that happens is the financial sector, explodes, and then some of it might trickle out into wages. So there's a timing thing there. Right. And then he's also concerned about the fact that you lose this beautiful signal of productivity. Like, oh, the price level is lower. That must mean we're more productive. Like, he was really into that. So that's part of it for him too.
Because I feel like one of the things you talk about with this a lot in your paper is the issue that you won't even see the productivity gains that you could see if it was fine for like the prices to all just go down and meet the increased productivity.
You're not necessarily going to activate the economy's full productive capacity unless you have incomes that are distributed more evenly among consumers. Because if the demand curve is flatter, if businesses know that they can make more profit by producing more goods at current prices rather than fewer goods at higher prices, then they'll do that. But if the incomes are more skewed, they'll produce fewer goods at higher prices and they won't activate the full economy. Is that what you're saying?
I think that's what I'm saying. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. But anyway, so he's not really getting into those kinds of concerns, I guess, with the distribution issue.
No, I don't think he mentions that at all in this article or in the book either.
I don't know if I have a theory for why this should lead things in the abstract to be more skewed over time, but I think because of maybe some of the automation things that we know are going on.
Why? What should lead things to be more skewed?
like why productivity rises without deflation, without basic income, would like lead to, I guess they wouldn't necessarily lead to any kind of difference in the distribution of money, but they seem to have, and I think that's because of
it's not that the productivity rises lead to that. It's that the increased the increased productive capacity of the economy leads to that, combined with the economy needing fewer resources and less labor to produce whatever it's producing. So you're getting more and more of an output gap, and you don't need to employ everyone to produce what you're producing. And now there are people who can't buy stuff, and then so that's kind of the process. Does that make sense?
becomes like a
Like
feedback.
Yang talks about how the labor participation rate's going down, but we're still producing the same amount of stuff, and all these people who are laid off or whatever, they go on disability or something like that, and they never go back to work.
Yeah, so I mean, one extreme is you could imagine an economy where we're producing the same amount of stuff just using less labor. So that's a productivity increase. Now, George Selgin doesn't really talk about this, like how are we not having deflation if we're producing less stuff? How are prices still staying where they are? And the answer is that this skewed distribution of incomes makes it profitable for firms to keep prices lower, for firms to keep prices higher at lower quantities. Yeah.
I can see in Selgin's utopia that the worker becomes twice as productive. The widget he's making becomes half as expensive.
Yes.
But the worker can make twice as many of them. And then the final part is he has to find twice as many customers as he did before. And then everybody's happy.
Yeah.
Right, because the other workers are the customers, and he's the customer of the other workers, and yeah.
And the price has gone down by half, so that should attract
Everyone,
more customers.
everyone works the same amount, gets twice as much stuff for the same amount of money. Yeah, that's his utopia. Yeah, I agree. Yep.
So why didn't that happen?
Yeah, because of all the stuff we talked about just now.
Because prices aren't allowed to fall, you're saying?
Well, because prices aren't allowed to fall, and two, if prices were allowed to fall, that probably it wouldn't end up shaking out that way anyway. Because we don't, labor is not an evenly distributed thing, so consumption is not going to be evenly distributed, and that kind of stuff. But I think the way Selgin thinks about it is that we are getting the benefits from higher productivity. It's just that the price that we're paying by keeping prices stable is that you've got a less stable financial sector, and maybe there's some lag there in the benefit that people are getting, and you don't get these price signals of productivity from the price level. But I think he's imagining that it's generally kind of working the way it's supposed to, and it would be even better if instead of keeping prices stable, and giving people more money, we gave people the same amount of money and allowed prices to decrease. But I don't think he has necessarily a full explanation for why we haven't been able to reap the full benefit of potential productivity, or the potential, yeah.
Is it sort of like that quote, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed?
No, I don't think it's like that, because I think a lot of the future isn't here, because the economy is not going to produce what people don't have the money to buy. It's not just that some people have a lot of money or have a lot of the stuff, it's that a lot of the stuff isn't getting made. It is true that some people have a lot more stuff than other people, but I think there's a large chunk of that future that just doesn't exist because people don't have the money to buy it.
No,
Yeah.
I think it's that there's these like the Oculus Rift like 5 years ago or something like that was like $500, but now it's like $200 or something like that. But people didn't buy it back then because it was so expensive.
Right.
And so these things existed back then, but they were such limited quantities that people didn't want them. And so the prices had to go down so that people would get them, and so they were distributed after the fact.
after they were invented. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So here's the next one. The relative rigidity of input prices and of the price of labor especially compared to output prices is also reason for doubting the widespread belief that a stable price level best avoids booms and busts. Suppose, for example, that productivity grows more rapidly than usual. In that case, a zero inflation policy requires a money growth rate sufficient to sustain the rate of factor price inflation equal to the rate of productivity growth. If, however, factor prices are rigid, more rapid monetary expansion may at first succeed in swelling corporate earnings without inducing any equivalent rise in factor prices. Firms' profits will then be artificially enhanced. Speculators who fail to appreciate the temporary nature of those swollen profits will bid up stock prices, generating a boom. Eventually, though, factor prices will respond positively to expanded earnings. Costs will catch up with revenues. So profits will shrink and share values will decline. The boom will give way to bust. Were the monetary authorities to stabilize not the level of output prices, but the level of input prices, or equivalently, the flow of nominal income or revenues, the boom-bust cycle might be avoided. Yeah.
I still have the same question. I don't know why I'm not getting the answer to this question.
Oh.
But like the question I still have is what leads the people's wages to inevitably be raised in this scenario? Like I guess I understood it in the abstract where you wouldn't even see the real productivity increase without people being able to buy the stuff. But now when I try to walk myself through this example and a specific company, why would they bother to raise the wages of people?
It's less about a specific worker at a specific company and more about the monetary stimulus allows firms to borrow more money and hire more workers. Or maybe there are firms that wouldn't even exist if money wasn't so easy and they hire workers and pay workers. So now they're competing for labor with the firms that are already there. It might bid up prices. But what he's emphasizing here is that there's a delay. That before that happens, you get the expansion, the speculative bubble.
Yeah, that's
exactly.
What do you think about that? That seems interesting.
I think it's generally right. I think if you are, he wants the Fed to tighten, to rein in the private financial sector, to keep it under control. And he is imagining that corresponds with deflation. I want the Fed to tighten, to rein in the private financial sector, to keep it under control. And I want them to do that in response to a higher basic income. So you can have tighter monetary policy and higher consumer incomes at the same time without risking the credit bubble.
Yeah, but this seems like a different mechanism. Like you talk a lot about the Fed's interest rates.
Yes.
This is just more micro, but this is something else where like they see high profits and then they get all excited about that. But the profits are temporary.
He's still talking about monetary stimulus, about lower interest rates and that type of thing as stimulating the.
But it seems like there's an additional issue here, which is that like there's a time delay that creates a signal that's incorrect about how well a company's doing.
Yeah, it fuels the speculative bubble. I would say that's something to worry about. Yeah.
I think when the basic income was initially introduced, that might happen, like a bust. But then when you get used to it, then it will become more stable.
Yeah, certainly. As we roll out the basic income, it induces the Fed to tighten and raise interest rates. That increases the chances that you have some kind of credit contraction or financial collapse or something like that. Obviously, the effects of it are not going to be as bad because people have money to spend even when the financial system is going through a transition. And then as you go and get basic income to the maximum level, you're not going to have these collapses anymore. But you're right. The transition, in order to keep the economy going today, we are riding asset bubbles. We are in an unstable situation, and there might not be a way to get out of it without having a little bit of bumpiness, at least in the financial sector. Yeah. Ready for the next one? Mm-hmm. Getting through here. The claim that deflation is painful to sellers, so they resist cutting prices, may be valid for malign demand-driven inflation, but it is not valid for deflation of the benign productivity-driven sort. When overall spending on goods and services shrinks, sellers may resist cutting prices until they can negotiate corresponding cuts in costs, thereby preserving their profit margins. For that reason, product prices are often set according to implicit contracts, promising some fixed percentage markup of prices above unit costs. But this practice, which accounts for the sluggish adjustment of product prices in response to changes in consumer spending, does not lead to sluggish price adjustment in response to changes in productivity. When productivity changes, so do unit costs of production. So adjustments in product prices are in fact required to preserve constant markups. Indeed, sellers actively seek ways to improve productivity just so that they can charge less than their rivals without sacrificing profits. Productivity-based price cuts are, in other words, a healthy aspect of the competitive process, which would occur routinely in most markets were it not for monetary authorities' success in offsetting productivity gains with equal or greater additions to the flow of nominal expenditures.
Is that like how you described before about how the interest rates of banks being different from the Fed's interest rates and how it takes them a while to adjust it to the...
No. This is essentially saying that if I produce tractors using a certain amount of resources, and now I can produce 2 tractors using the same amount of resources, now I have increased my profit margin, and if I want to be competitive, I can lower the price of the tractors and beat out the competition. So that's kind of like the natural deflation isolated to kind of one producer who got more productive. Does that make sense? Yeah. And Tommy says, he mentions fluctuating consumer spending. Basic income seems to have a lot more to do with that piece than anything else. So let's see if we can find that quote. Fluctuations.
That's going to be in there a lot.
I don't think it's in that part. Basic income certainly smooths out consumer spending. If it's just a regular, reliable income of a certain amount. Oh, it's the same quote. Okay. Let's go back. Where were we? Oh, it's this one. Changes in consumer spending.
I think he means when overall spending on goods and services shrinks. That's a version of fluctuating consumer spending.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So he is imagining a scenario in which the spending on goods and services shrinks. Sellers may resist cutting prices until they can negotiate corresponding cuts in costs, thereby preserving their profit margins. For that reason, product prices are often set according to implicit contracts. I think with basic income, you don't have to worry about this at all. You can keep consumer spending up as sustained by the basic income. He's imagining that. I don't know if there's anything to say beyond that.
Did we answer your question?
Basic income seems to have a lot more to do with that piece than anything else.
It stabilizes consumer spending.
Yeah, I mean, you stabilize consumer spending and you can keep the price level stable. And you don't have to have deflation in response to increases of productivity, and you also don't have to have excessive monetary stimulus in response to increases of productivity. And the incomes are distributed evenly, so all the consumers can benefit.
I guess I'd wonder about his description that product prices are often set according to a fixed percentage markup of price. I mean, I know that happens sometimes, like government contracts, military contracts, 15% of the cost, whatever. But in general, I'm not sure that that's the case.
I think what he's imagining is a competitive firm who has a minimum profit margin that they're willing to accept in order to stay in business. Yeah. So if something comes along that allows them to cut prices while maintaining the same profit margin, that gives them a competitive advantage, and then competition will bring it down to the level where they're back at the same profit margin that they had before.
Yeah, I think he's imagining like they would want to have a higher profit margin, but competition is keeping it to like the minimum they would accept, right, per item, I guess.
Right. So then you end up with the same profit margin again with lower prices.
But I could imagine, to Brian's point, that their minimum might not be per item. It might be like a total profit minimum that they're willing to accept.
Yeah, and none of this is going to be perfect. And as we all know, competition is not perfect either. Right. So this is kind of like an ideal, an idealized version of how things would work. But I think it's, I think the intuition is probably right that if one firm gets more productive, they're going to lower their prices a little bit, and then if their competitor gets more productive, it'll eventually, bring it down again, that kind of thing. We can have a debate as to like how prevalent that is. I mean, when I think about prices in the economy, I usually even imagine monopoly prices. So that's why I talk about like firms setting the prices at whatever is most profitable and stuff like that.
Like buying out their competitors before they get too large?
Or just, finding ways of avoiding competition on price to maximize their profits. So that can be competing on dimensions other than price. It can be collusion. It can be some things that are illegal, some things that are not illegal, that kind of stuff. You kind of go
to the opposite extreme in your models, I guess.
Right. Yeah. So I always imagine competition as kind of this second order effect on prices, that the main thing is firms are trying to maximize their profit and set the prices and quantities at the most profitable level. Then competition might bring that down a little bit. Yeah. And in extreme cases, competition might bring it down a lot, but I don't, assume perfect competition. Yeah.
And so, a lot of what happens is, like you said, like if there's just the same people having more money and they've already kind of tapped out how many items they want to buy, then it makes sense to compete on other dimensions, make it like, which can also be good, like make it more of a good item or just make it more of a luxury brand of a kind of item or whatever, which would not be an example of the price staying at the same margin, like the profit margin might go up per item in those cases.
Or they can make more, instead of making a luxury item, they can make a bunch of, like a luxury suitcase, they can make a bunch of consumer suitcases for regular people.
That would be the opposite effect, yeah, exactly. So the profit per item has got to be like much higher on a luxury suitcase than like consumer suitcases.
Yeah, you're competing for a different market segment almost. Yeah. It's like a smaller number of people who are buying your thing but paying a higher price. Yeah. So probably all central bankers appreciate the importance of allowing particular money prices to reflect changing cost conditions in particular industries. Everyone understands that computers are being produced more efficiently today than they were a decade ago. That this information is most readily conveyed to consumers and entrepreneurs through a lower price tag on computers seems obvious. Yet central bankers refuse to extend this logic to cover general changes in productivity. In reality, not only computers, but also most other goods and services are being produced at a lower real cost. That is, with less land, labor, and capital per unit today than was the case a decade ago. Between 1991 and 1997, overall unit costs of production in the private sector declined at an average annual rate of just over 0.8%. So why shouldn't the general price level be allowed to decline so as to reflect this fact? The answer is for no reason at all, save central bankers' unwarranted belief that deflation, even a little deflation, can never be in consumers' best interest. So, I mean, the reason is that you want stable money.
But I think it's more than that, because as we talked about earlier, like it doesn't seem so unstable to have small amounts of deflation, similar to small amounts of inflation.
Small amounts of deflation might be okay, but you don't want to tie it to the productivity increases.
Those could be
There's no point in doing that.
Yeah. What about the switching over from the regular hard drives to the SSD drives, the solid state drives.
Yeah, that's an example of this kind of thing.
But the solid state drives were much more expensive, but they were so much better and faster and whatever.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question, because the quality of goods that are available to the economy changes over time.
what
So how do you
could be
compare
how
a
do you
market
compare the
basket
prices?
today
Yeah.
to 100 years ago,
That's hard. Yeah.
10 years ago even? These things are really difficult, and people argue about it all the time. I decide, I choose not to get in the weeds on that stuff, but we have a general sense of how the price level changes over time, and depending on what price index you use, it could be a little bit different, that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, it's not for no reason at all. It's because we want a stable standard unit of value, and it could be okay to have that amount of deflation, between 1991 and 1997. That might be okay, but we wouldn't allow it because of productivity increases. We would allow it because we're targeting zero inflation. It happens to go on the deflation side, and maybe we're okay with that in a world with basic income in the 90s. Yeah. So I'll do the last one here. Once the possibility of benign deflation is fully appreciated, zero inflation itself will come to be recognized as an overly expansionary policy. That is, as a mere stepping stone on the way to something even better. Not so much. I don't think so.
But he's so inspired.
He's so inspired. Yeah. I think he doesn't have basic income in his mind, and he's not thinking about basic income in the way that we are. So that's part of it.
This is from 1999.
This is from 1999. Yeah.
Hence all the 90s.
Hence all the 90s references.
It all comes
So yeah, I want to go around and get people's final thoughts on deflation and the article and basic income.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I learned some more nuances today, and I'm still puzzling over some other additional nuances. I think the big picture I get, but I think I had this idea of deflation as more unstable than maybe it actually is under all conditions, at least with the basic income or that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I did kind of update my beliefs a little bit, but it was interesting.
I just had the thought that related to the Baumol effect that we were talking about.
Yeah.
Once that, in Selgin's world, the prices of kitchen appliances would go down, but since there's been no improvement in productivity of, say, teachers and nurses and physicians and other completely labor-intensive tasks, their price would not have gone down at all.
Right.
So it would be sort of a graph like this. But today we have the graph that's just sort of rotated, so that the price of a washing machine is sort of the same, and we're all wondering why the price of labor-intensive wages for labor-intensive jobs is going up.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking about it. Yeah, Brian.
Yeah, I had a similar thought to Steve's, that the quality of good of whatever's going into the products that are being made can go down, and he seems more focused on just productivity as opposed to people substituting plastic for metal, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
The other thing is about this article overall, I wonder how much of this is a principled objection that he has to the way that inflation works, that the bankers are profiting from the extra money going into the system, as opposed to a basic income model where everyone would benefit equally.
Yeah. That's interesting.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Elizabeth.
I think I understand the economics slightly better than when I started. I appreciated the point about sort of how he talks about general productivity, but that doesn't actually translate necessarily for specific industries, the sort of farmer thing of you can't, that the sort of aggregate model just doesn't actually work. Felt really helpful.
Yeah. Richard.
Well, deflation, we didn't really get into that one where from 1873 to 1896, where the deflationary period was actually good for the economy or something like that.
Or so George Selgin would claim. Yeah. But I think that's one of his main examples of the good kind of deflation. Tommy has a couple comments on here. So this guy doesn't like central monetary policy. I see two dimensions for a currency. Has monetary policy or doesn't, his dimension, and basic income or doesn't. Clearly, it's better to have monetary policy and no basic income than to have neither. But if we have basic income, then is it better to have monetary policy or no monetary policy? So I think you're always going to need monetary policy. So basic income can provide the steady stream of consumer income, but then you need monetary policy to kind of pick up the fluctuations and volatility. But you can keep interest rates a lot higher than where they are now, because right now the economy is kind of overstimulated. So you'd have tighter monetary policy, but it's still a little bit flexible. Then if you start seeing interest rates come down, if you start seeing monetary policy bring interest rates down more than you would like, you can start to increase the basic income to balance it out. So the basic income is kind of like the long run adjustment, and then the monetary policy is short run fluctuations, that it would keep prices stable in the short run. Maybe we can appease him once basic income is enacted. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how much he's thought about basic income. I think it's certainly better than having deflation, because you're not doing it through the labor market anymore primarily.
And basic income was a fringe policy in 1999.
Yeah. Mitchell says the part where it repeated at the end of the article threw him for a loop. I think in the long term, deflation in the overall economy is not ideal, but deflation on certain goods are good at times. I think that's right. So thanks for the discussion, guys. We're not sold on deflation, but it was an interesting exploration, and the topic of inflation comes up a lot. So glad we had a discussion on deflation. Mm-hmm. Next week, we're going to be on Friday, because Bethany and I are traveling, and I wanted to squeeze one in. And we're going to be talking about next Tuesday's presidential debate, which is going to be the first one without Andrew Yang, probably. So we'll see if there's going to be any basic income related discussion. Yeah.
Wait, so we will